Good day, Western Civ 1 students. In our study of the Middle Ages today, we're going to begin exploring the very important idea of feudalism. Feudalism, Feudalism. Feudalism. But feudalism is two things at the same time. One is a social system, and the other is an economic system. So I'm going to devote one lecture to the economics of feudalism and the other to the social structures of feudalism. This is the economics lecture. How did people live and earn a living under the feudal dispensation, which predominated in parts of Europe from around the year 800 till around the year 1400? In the countryside, this is how much of Western Europe lived in the high Middle Ages and even into the later Middle Ages. Now, what you're seeing here on your screen now is a manor farm. And I've written it up here, the Manor Farm, M-A-N-O-R, Manor Farm. You might have heard of a manor before. Well, a feudal manor was an agricultural community in and of itself. It was an entire farm that was lived on by hundreds of people and farmed by dozens of people. Now, each manor farm had a lord. Now, this lord could be a knight or he could be a baron. These were knights and noblemen who were the lords. And we'll talk about the feudal system that governed the people at the top of society in the next lecture. But in this lecture, I'm talking about how they lived. And this is sort of a schematic of a typical manor farm. And they would have the manor. This house right here is the manor of the Lord. This would be a large home, large by the standards of the time. I don't want you to imagine a 100-room castle, or, it could be a castle. In a few places, it would be a castle. But we're probably talking here about more of a 5-room house or 10-room house where a knight would live. Or if the lord of the manor was a baron, that baron probably owns dozens of manor farms, and not 95% of the time he would not be living there. Instead, the person who would be living there was called a steward, S-T-E-W-A-R-D. A steward would be living in the manor house and managing the manor farm the way the lord of the manor would do if he were living there at the time. If he's a knight, he may be there most of the time. If he's a duke or an earl or a baron, probably he owns dozens of manor farms, and he will not be there very frequently, and the steward will be living there, taking care of the manor farm for him. Now, the lord of the manor had lands of his own that were farmed. That's what I've marked up here. I'll move a little closer so you can see it. The domain of the manor farm. You can see that domain has the beginning of the Latin word dominus in it, or dominical. That's the word for lord. Dominus is the word for lord in Latin. So these are the lord's lands. The domain. In French, it's called domaine, but in English, domain. These were the lands that were actually farmed in the name of the lord of the manor. Now, obviously, if you're a nobleman, you're not getting out there and getting your hands dirty. Instead, peasants who lived on the manor farm did the actual work on the domain. But they had other work to do of their own. So we're going to have to talk about how that worked. You'll see on this manor farm, I've marked a village here and a village here. A large manor farm might have 10 villages on it. These things could be many miles across. But small clumps of people would live in villages on the manor. They might be 5 houses, 10 houses, little cottages where the peasant farmers lived. Now, what you see around it, these are the actual fields of the village. And these fields were often very long, but strangely narrow. If you're used to a modern farm, which, may be 500 acres or more, these things were often 20 feet wide and 200 feet long. More like a runway for an airplane than what you'd think of as an agricultural field. But they radiated away from the village like spokes away from the hub of a bicycle wheel. Why? Well, first off, the reason they're long and skinny. Until the high Middle Ages, you could not use a horse to plow a field. You had to use oxen in Western Europe. Horses, they didn't have what's called a horse collar. A collar you put around the shoulders of a horse so it can pull a heavy load. Those things the horse collar was invented in the Middle Ages, around the year 1000. So if you tried to harness a horse to a plow before, you'd probably choke him. They used oxen instead, and they put big yokes. I'm sure you've seen a yoke on an oxen in the picture, at least. But oxen are big, lumbering beasts. They eat a lot. And a village, an entire manor might have only 5 or 6 oxen for the whole manor. And all the fields were plowed by a team of that 6 oxen. So it might take a couple of months to plow these fields. But one other thing about when you've got yokes of oxen, you don't want to have to try to turn them around. 6 teams of oxen yoked together with wooden yokes are very unwieldy. Trying to turn them can, take up huge amounts of space, or you could unyoke them all and turn them around in the short term and yoke them again. Just imagine how long that would take. So the solution they came up with was to have 200 feet long furrows. So you only had to plow like 4 of them to do a field. They were 20 feet wide and 200 feet long. So they wouldn't have to turn the yoke of oxen that plowed the field around very often. Hence these ridiculously long, skinny fields. Now you'll see I've made several fields around each village, and they radiate like spokes. Now that's because each family in the village got a field in each portion of the area around the village. And actually, customarily, most places, they divided the fields up differently every single year. A sort of committee of farmers would make sure every family got a piece of land in every area around the village, but that those lands might actually rotate. The farmers don't own that land. The Lord does. They farm it. But you want to make sure each family gets a fair cut. So every year they might get a piece of really good farmland, but next year it might not be so good. That's why they kind of rearrange them every year so that over a period of 5 or 6 years, every family got some good land and some poor land, and it all kind of averaged out. Interesting to see how our ancestors could think through challenging problems, right? But they don't own this land. The Lord owns the land. They farm the land, and they get a portion of the grain that they harvest from this land, or the vegetables. They get to keep a piece of that for their family, and the Lord gets a big chunk of it. Now, it's not like they're renting the land from the Lord. He owns this land. They have only the right to farm it. That's because these people are serfs. S-E-R-F. Serf. A serf is tied to this land. This serf cannot leave the village in which he's born unless the Lord of the manor gives him permission to do so. He must live his whole life farming these fields according to the traditional rules of the manor. The tradition tells how much of the grain or vegetables he gets to keep. and how much goes to the Lord. And you'll see another village down here. There could, as I say, be 5 or even 10 villages on a single manor farm. Each village follows these traditional rules. And the serfs in the village work the land but don't own it. They are tied to the land. They can't leave it without the Lord's permission. But they are not slaves. Do not misunderstand. A serf is not a slave. Technically, a serf is a free man or woman, but they are tied to the land. If the land changes hand from one lord to another, the serf stays put, and they have a new lord. But they're not slaves. They have rights. The rights are determined by the traditional law of the manor. These things have been handed down generation to generation. So serfs have rights. They just don't have the right to leave. It's very interesting. It's very different in our world. They're not slaves. Now, there could be, and there sometimes were, totally free men and women in these villages, in which case they might actually own these fields. They might buy them from the Lord if somehow they came up with enough money to pull it off. And if they bought that land and they paid them extra for their freedom from serfdom, they were free peasants. Free peasants were called villeins, the men and women of the village, you might say. And they could come and go as they wanted. They were their own masters. But that could be dangerous. If you are a serf, the Lord has an incentive to look after you. After all, you're the one who works his land on the domain, and the rules of the manor told them, the traditional laws of the manor told them, the customary law, that's the term, customary law, told them how many weeks of the year they had to work the Lord's land, and the rest of the time they got to work the fields they had been assigned, and they got to keep the produce from those fields. The Lord gets all this produce, of course. So it's very interesting. 2 other things you'll see here. This is the copse. Copse, C-O-P-S-E. A copse is a managed woodland. It's not a wild forest. It is a forest mostly for firewood and building materials. And there were foresters who looked after these copses. My name Foster is a corruption of forester. So presumably at some distant time, my ancestors were the people who managed for some lord their copses. And they would make sure that nobody took more than the amount of firewood they were entitled to. And generally, they got a certain number of measures of wood each year for their firewood. Each village peasant, each serf got a certain amount of wood, a measure of wood. And then they could take dead wood that might be in the copse. They could get it if they could pull it out of the tree without sawing. So they had long hooks. They could try to pull the branch out of the tree. Or they could push up against the branch, and if it broke off when they pushed up, they could keep that wood too. And they had a little crook on the end of a stick they could push up with. This is where our expression, by hook or by crook, came from. The wood you could get by hook or by crook, you could use in addition to your annual allotment of firewood. Isn't that interesting? This is the common land. This is grazing land for the animals of the villagers. And it's called commons because any one of the villagers can graze their animals there. It does not belong to anybody individually. It is the common grazing land. So you have here, and each manor would have had a church. The lord of the manor appointed the priest who was the pastor of the church. In this era, by the way, you went to church every Sunday. It was not optional. It was considered essential for your salvation to go unless you were gravely ill. People always went to church. They didn't choose who their pastor was. The Lord of the manor did that. They had only one church to go to. You went to the church of your manor farm. So it was a little different than our time, but they were extremely regular churchgoers compared to today. So that is a manor farm. It was the economic engine of the Middle Ages in Western Europe. 99% of the food consumed in Western Europe came from the animals grazed on these commons, the crops raised in these village fields or on the domain lands of the Lord. And by the way, he, of course, would sell most of that in the markets of the nearby market town. I'll talk more about the houses and the like. Keep this image in your head. We're going to come back to it. It's very important for understanding the social history of the European Middle Ages. But this is the Manor Farm, the economic engine of the feudal era. Thank you.